This afternoon, we're thrilled to host Louis Deslauriers, who will be speaking on deliberate practice homework to enhance effectiveness of active learning. So I'm now going to turn the proceedings over to MIT Professor Dave Pritchard, who will introduce Dr. Deslauriers to us. So David, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you, Molly, but thank you more, Louis, for deciding that you can give this via Zoom. And so here you are. I probably met Louis years ago when he was doing atomic physics, as was I. And what I remember about his work is the question of how do you keep an ion very cold, quantumly in the lowest vibrational state when it's in a trap, an electromagnetic trap. And what he showed in Chris Monroe's group was that the dominant source of decoherence, of quantum decoherence, was the shaking of the ion due to the thermal motion of charges in the surface of the trap. And I thought that was a pretty definitive paper, and people have gone on to refrigerate traps and so on. Now, he shortly thereafter saw the light and moved to doing educational research with Carl Wyman and did a classic paper, at least it's perceived that way by the community, in which they replaced 1 week of lectures in a regular E&M course with some enthusiastic young but trained only for this purpose TAs or lecturers who basically used a whole host of PER proved kinds of methods and got dramatically improved results at the test on the end of the week relative to the control group, which was taught by the crusty old professor like me, I assume. That has been kind of a hallmark of his work, which I highly respect, which is, how do we actually reform the class, and what kind of tests or evidence do we accept that we have improved the learning of the students? And he's also gotten slightly off that track with some good recent work on the attitudes of students towards these more interactive and active forms of learning. It turns out that the key point is that although they learn more, they think they learn less. And this is something we have to think as a community about how we're going to overcome this to show them that they actually learn more in a way that they believe. Anyway, today, Louis is talking about an area that's one of my favorite and I think most neglected in education. If you ask MIT students, where do you learn the most? And you give them, reading stuff, doing homework, going to lectures, they all say, oh man, if I want to do well on the test, I have to do the homework. So I learn the most during homework. Then if you look at education researchers across the board and you say, what do they study? The answer is they study what goes on in class. Well, so there's an impedance mismatch there. And today's talk, which is about deliberate practice, addresses just this mismatch, in my opinion, and I can't wait to hear more. So Louis, go ahead.
Well, thank you so much for the kind introduction, and David, thank you for the invitation very much. And Molly, thank you for arranging this. This is all wonderful. I'm happy to be here. To talk to you about some interesting topics in science education. So let me, so today actually I'm going to talk about how do we increase the effectiveness of active learning, both in lecture and in homework. So David, don't worry, I will talk about the homework quite a bit, but the part about the lecture is a fan favorite, so I'll make sure to devote some time to that. So just to make sure that we're on the same setting here. So a definition of active learning that will work for us today is to say whenever students are actively engaged in tasks that are productive toward a learning goal. That may seem like a broad definition to you, but active learning in the last 5 to 10 years, it's exploded. I mean, the scope has exploded. the sophistication, has increased a great deal. So a more apt definition would be something like that involves social active learning, physical active learning, like embodied cognition. That's a very powerful way to learn certain skills. And then there's cognitive active learning, which is what we're going to focus on today. In fact, specifically, we're going to focus on how do we increase the productivity of cognitive active learning. So for active learning to work, you have to have active engagement, and you also have it to be productive. Not too much details, but let me just point out here, when a student reads a book intently, or a student listens to a traditional lecture with intent, they're, actively engaged, right? So the first half is satisfied, but we know that it's not as productive as it could be. All right, so active learning, of course, everyone has heard of that. It's becoming the norm, but I'm putting that in quotation because there was a very nice survey that was published a few years ago that looked at, the pedagogy used in STEM courses across North American universities. And what they found is roughly 50% of courses have some elements of active learning in them. So compared to 10 years ago, that's amazing improvement. However, only about 10 to 15% of them can be deemed fully student-centered. And the definition of that was something like, if 50% of the time in lecture is devoted to active learning, then you can be fully student-centered. So yes, it's come a long way in the last 10 years, but there's much longer to go. In fact, the evidence for active learning is so strong at this point that one wonders what's holding it back. What are the reasons, right? So one for sure, there are many practical reasons. Like, for example, someone that wants to switch active learning, they need some training. Training is not always available. There's departmental support, teaching relief or something like that. So there are a lot of practical reasons why there's this slow progression. But one reason that we investigated that, as far as I'm concerned, had not been touched on before is something from cognitive psychology labs. It's the role of fluency and feeling of learning and how it relates to instruction and, passive instruction or active learning. So I'll talk about that first, and then I'll talk about the homework transformation. In fact, to talk about the homework transformation, we need to talk about that first. You'll see why. So what do the transform lectures look like? So it's not peer instruction, which a lot of you, I'm assuming, are familiar with. It doesn't use clickers. It uses something akin to worksheets that look a little bit like this. So basically, when you have your 90-minute lecture, a lot of you probably are teachers. So when you have a 90-minute lecture, if you look at it carefully, there's probably 4 to 7 big learning goals in there. So for each learning goal, then we design an activity that covers that learning goal. And as you'll see, that's part of deliberate practice. We want to make sure that students know exactly which skill they're practicing. So here for activity 1, what does that look like? Well, first there's a preamble, about a minute, where the instructor just tries to motivate students to work hard on the activity, explain to students what the activity is about and what they can expect to do, basically, what the point is. Then the instructor says, all right, get into groups of 3 or 4 and then work, on this activity together. And then the instructor roams the room, tries to see what they're doing, listen to what they're saying. And then the instructor after that just interrupts everyone once you see that the most advanced groups are done. And then you give the feedback, for about the same amount of time as the activity lasted. So the feedback, it's very important that it not only shows students the correct way to do things, but it spends an equal amount of time on the incorrect thinking that the instructor noticed when he or she was walking around. So the whole thing lasts 10 to 15 minutes, and then you rinse and repeat for activity 2, the next learning goal, and so forth and so forth. And then sometimes you have a quiz just to keep students sort of motivated. So this type of active learning, its effectiveness has been demonstrated. That's what David was referring to. It's a while back with Carl Wyman. So basically, I mean, David already sort of described it, so let me go quickly through this. So we took, two large lecture sections, I'm sorry, of the same class, like 300 students or so. And one section received the control treatment. That means the instructor, one of the most highly rated instructor in the department, taught this section for a whole week, 3 lectures. And the other instructor, which happened to be me actually, taught the, using active learning that I just described here. So for me at the time, I was not nearly as experienced as that person. So I was relatively inexperienced. So anyway, the point is that we followed the exact same learning objective. I mean, to very, very small learning objectives, the exact same class time. And at the end of the week, there was a test of learning for everyone. And then what we saw, of course, is a very large difference between how much students learn on the tests with active learning, which is the white colored distribution, right, versus how much they learn with traditional lectures. So that was a very, very large gap. And the reason why the gap was so large, in fact, it surprised a lot of people back then, is that this was the whole point of the study, was to focus on how much students are learning in lecture only. Because if you're going to do an intervention in lecture, and then there's additional exposure to information outside of lecture, like during homework, during recitation, during labs, and so forth, then of course, whatever intervention you do in lecture, its effect is going to be diluted, right? So for us here, the effect was not diluted because we literally measured what happened in lecture. And if I recall correctly, because that's a while back, we surveyed students. We asked them who read the book outside of lecture because they were told not to read the book. And those who did, we removed them from the data. So it's truly isolating what happened in lecture. So yeah, so we showed that it's effective. And now look, as a comparison, this is a course at Harvard. This is the course actually that I'll talk about a lot in the homework transformation. And these two distributions, same as what I just showed you. In red is when the course was taught traditionally. And in white, the white distribution is when the course was taught, in a transformed manner with active learning. The same active learning, again, that I described already. You see that the two distributions are much closer together. And the reason why is that these are the results of a final examination, a 3-hour final examination. So you see that the intervention we did in lecture was diluted a bit with the exposure and the homework and so forth. So that's what you expect. And as usual, and as you expect, the failure rates go down significantly when you transform a course to active learning. And something else is that the most advanced students, which is often a concern of some faculty members, the most advanced students here on the right, you can see that they benefit just as much from the active learning. So it's not like these ideas of, oh, we're spoon feeding students and the most advanced ones are not going to benefit quite as much. That is not the case. Yeah. So on to the first part here that I promised, the study that talks about feelings of learning, students' feelings and their role in the classroom. And you'll see that this is a lot more than just students don't like to eat their vegetables. I promise. This is actually very, very important, and it's too often overlooked. So the punchline, I'll tell you right away, like David said, is that the feeling of learning, students' feeling of learning, is not always proportional to learning. Okay, in fact, we found that in traditional lectures, students feel like they learn a lot, but obviously the learning is not as much as with the active learning. I'll show that to you in a second. So yeah, so when you have active learning, and especially with the type of active learning that we use, which I'd call, or I'd refer to as high intensity active learning, that means I would say there's a lot of learning per unit time. It's very effortful. And in surveys that we have with students, they always say that they're quite tired, which I understand because it's very intense. So anyway, the increased cognitive effort that students feel, of course, it's like working out your muscles. It doesn't always feel very comfortable. right? And it turns out that this comfort feeling or this fluency feeling, we know that from psychology, is a very powerful metacognitive cue that we all use, not just students, same for us, a cue that we use to know if something is, an explanation is useful or not useful. And you know what? That certainly works when someone gives you directions to go somewhere, right? You use that metacognitive cue and you know what? It's probably accurate. So when it comes to assembling IKEA furniture, for example, if you don't understand the instructions, it's probably because they're in Swedish. Just kidding. So we found that feeling of learning can be anti-correlated to actual learning. So let's see here. So how did we measure the feeling of learning? Well, at the end of a learning session, you literally ask students on a survey, how much do you think that you've learned? Okay, so you'll see, I'll show you the survey. So does it matter? Well, of course it matters. I mean, one, it matters for course evaluations. I mean, all departments and all disciplines, we have our superstar lecturers. One of ours at Harvard is Logan McCarty, which I think many of you probably know. There's also Greg Keston. Anyway, there's superstar lecturers and they always get really high valuations. But the kicker with them is that they're now doing active learning and they're getting the same high valuation. So anyway, good on them. So anyway, course evaluations, resistance to active learning, that plays a big role there. And of course, for those of you who are in science education, then metacognition, poor self-regulation are probably the most important parts here. So yeah, unreliable self-assessment is really bad for learning. And this attitude of saying, look, whenever I do active learning, students always come on board at some point in the semester. That's true. And in fact, typically it's after, an exam or something where students can see their own understanding. They can see, okay, they're learning something. The attitudes start to change. But if you wait until then, in the meantime, there's a lot of damage that's been done. And one thing actually that's pretty simple to see is group work. If you only have one student as part of a group of 4 students that just doesn't feel like he or she's learning, then this attitude in the group can really reduce the effectiveness of the group work. Anyway, it's very important. So how did we measure this? Well, first, we conducted that in a large first-year course for physics majors. It was a mechanics course. And we did that twice in 2 different years. And we got the same results. So let's see what it looks like. It was highly controlled. So for the class on statics equilibrium, that's a topic in physics, we randomly assigned students to 2 groups. One group learned the information with the active learning. The other group, they learned it with a nice traditional lecture. So what we did here, and it's important to, what we did here, and it's important to emphasize, is that of course the active learning was dialed up. And by dialed up means, it was done very well, right? It was done by highly trained instructors. That was one of them. And the other one was Logan McCarty. Here at the bottom, the passive instruction, that was done by what I would say superstar lecturers, only because we just practice, a great deal before giving those lectures. So as far as students were concerned, they were receiving traditional instruction from superstar lecturers. Anyway, so at the end of lecture, then students had the feeling of learning survey, it takes a minute, and then a test of learning, like a mini exam. And of course, we found that students learn more with active learning than they did over here, but the feeling of learning was more pronounced with the traditional instruction. And over here, what we did, we switched topic and we flipped the groups, okay, just to control for several factors. And of course, we got the same results. So something I want to emphasize here, and that's something that bothered me since the big study in 2011, is that whenever people compare traditional instruction to some form of active learning, you can say that the topics are the same, but of course the activities that are used, like clicker questions, for example, that are used with the active learning are not the same activities. That's what's used in the traditional instruction. Whereas the type of active learning that we used here allowed us to actually expose students to the same activities, the same information, okay? So both groups of students received the same handouts where it said activity 1, activity 2, activity 3. Their brains received the same thing. The only difference, however, is that with the active learning, students had to be in a group, work on the activity for about 5 minutes. It was very difficult. Then they got interrupted. And then the instructor gave the feedback in 5 minutes. And right, the feedback was what's correct, what the instructor noticed about their incorrect thinking, and so forth. Now, when it came to the smooth, highly fluent traditional instruction, the instructor went through the activity much more slowly and much more deliberately, but still the instructor went through the same information, the same activity. So that's pretty cool, right? That students were exposed to the same information and we still got increased learning. So to me, that was a loophole that I was happy to fill. Okay, let's not worry about that slide. I don't know why I kept that. That's just to show all the controls that we had for that study. It's not important for our purpose here. But here are the results. You can see this is learning, right? In dark gray, you have the people in the active learning section. And of course, they learn more than traditional section. That's not surprising. And then here you have one of the survey questions. I feel like I learned a great deal from this lecture. So you see that there's this anti-correlation, right? That these students felt that they learned less than over here. And just to make a point here, look at these 2 questions. I enjoyed this lecture. Look at the people in the active learning section. They agree, right? A 4, they enjoyed it. The instructor was effective at teaching. Look at the active learning. They agree. So that's why sometimes it bothers me when someone reads that paper and they say, oh, it shows that students don't like active learning. That's not true. And we actually cranked up the dial. I mean, we really made them work hard. They still liked it. So students love active learning. So the point of that paper is that not just students, but adults as well are very sensitive to the fluency in an explanation. If you crank that up, then there could be issues. And it turns out those issues are still there with active learning because, for example, and pay attention to that if you can, with peer instruction, I mean, half of the time is spent with the instructor explaining the answer to a clicker question, a conceptual clicker question. That's a mini lecture. So the role of fluency really matters here. Turns out that there's a paper that was written on that. So by Michelle Smith, yeah, I wish I would have had a slide on that. So we changed topic, fluids, we found the exact same thing, no difference. So something that was interesting is that at the end of the survey, we asked them this self-check question here. This lecture mostly involved me as a listener while the instructor presented the information. And look, people that were in the passive sections, they agreed. Yes, I was a passive listener. Okay, now just to tell you, it's not a 5, which is strongly agree, simply because students were allowed to ask questions. Okay, and then of course with the active section, you can see that students are like, no, not as much, because there was the instructor feedback where they were listening, but a lot of the other time they were working with their peers. The point is students knew in green here that they were not actively engaged, and yet they felt that they learned more. So how do we explain this anti-correlation? I already told you. It's just this danger with the fluency in an explanation, okay? And we're all sensitive to that, adults included. So something else, there's something called the Kruger-Dunning effect, that if you're a novice learner, then you'll overestimate your understanding of something. But we think that those things are secondary. The main explanation is at the top. And the fact that if it's some of these students, it was their first exposure to active learning, so it's possible that this enhanced this effect. Yeah. So more importantly, what can instructors do? By the way, I should stop here and say, we should wait until the end for you guys to ask questions. And I worry that I'm speaking too quickly. So I would love for people to just interrupt and to ask questions. So feel free to do that. Yeah, so what can instructors do? Well, you have to intervene early on. In fact, at the end of that paper, we have a 15-minute intervention, the results of a 15-minute intervention at the beginning of the course. Something as simple as that, we show that it actually made a difference in student attitudes throughout the semester and until the end of the semester. So of course, throughout the semester, it certainly is useful if you reiterate the value of cognitive effort and remind them about this notion of feeling of learning, fluency, and actual learning. Students respond to that, they recognize that. And very important, have an assessment early on. Don't wait until the middle of the semester, because when you have the assessment, students can really gauge their own learning there, and they need that to get on board. But to me, the most important message of that paper is not for students, it's for instructors. Look, I love having these debates with people that do traditional lecturing. And I guarantee you, I'm convinced that if I would have never gotten into science education, I would be a hardcore proponent of traditional lectures. I just know it, I feel it through my bones. So I love having these debates with people that believe in traditional lectures. And what it always comes down to is this cognitive dissonance, is that people say, look, when I was younger, I had great lecturers, and you know what? I learned in these courses. I learned a lot from them, right? So they're basically saying, I know there's all that literature. I'm not stupid, right? I know it's there, but at the same time, it conflicts with what I've experienced when I was younger. Now that I can bring up that paper, it's interesting how these discussions have changed. Now they go down to a different level. It's what I'm being told is essentially, okay, I'll give it to you that students don't learn as much, but at least I'm keeping them motivated. So maybe someone can try to write a paper about motivation. Okay, on to the topic here of homework transformation. So this is a homework transformation that's done in courses whose lectures are already optimized with active learning. So that's an important point to make. So yeah, so look, in most STEM courses, students spend a lot of time in homework. In fact, when we keep track of the hours that they spend during the week, it's often twice as much time during the homework as they do with the teaching staff in lecture and during recitation. Okay, so if there's anything that you can do with the homework, you can do a lot of damage. Okay, I'm being silly here. That's a misattributed quote. So what is deliberate practice? Well, it's a set of fundamental principles that determine how people learn complex skills. Okay, so little over 30 years ago, psychologists like Anders Ericsson, who died last summer, by the way, that's very sad. So Anders Ericsson started looking at how experts, musicians, athletes, chess players, how they basically acquired their expertise, how they became the best in their domain. And they identified specific elements that are common across all domains. Okay, so that's pretty amazing. So there's nothing that's peculiar to tennis or peculiar to violin playing or something like that. There are commonalities that are there. So first, you need an expert coach. And the expert coach, hopefully, I won't explain what it is now, but hopefully you'll get a good feeling of what an expert coach is in the next 15 minutes or so, and why it's so critical that we understand that in education. Anyway, so an expert coach will identify the complex problems, like I put one as an example here, like students being able to find the electric field from an arbitrary charge distribution, for them to know if they use Gauss's law or Coulomb's law and how to use these things. Yeah, so a complex task. And I want you to also think in sports like Olympic diving. You have the expert coach there that is supposed to teach the athlete how to do a quadruple somersault or whatever it's called, to jump in the water without making too much of a splash. So that would be the complex task. And then the expert coach has to know how to break this down into sub-skills, not 150 of them, just the minimum number of sub-skills to achieve to be able to master the complex task. And then, of course, the learner has to practice the sub-skills a lot and receive feedback throughout. So that's easy to do if you're with an expert coach one-on-one, but of course, we're talking about homework. So there's no teaching staff that's with the students. So how do you provide feedback and all that? That's what I'll talk about. And then of course you need to start synthesizing those sub-skills, to bring them together. And then finally, the student has to practice the complex task, all the while getting feedback, okay? So it's very important that each step be explicit to students. When a student is practicing one sub-skill, let's say that an analogy would be the diver that's practicing the toes on the diving board. It's important that the diver not only understands that's what they're practicing, but where it fits into the entire complex skill, if you will. Okay, and you'll see how we try to do that. That's important. And what's nice is that those transform homework are naturally adaptive to student skill level. So the way we build them is that we make sure that the most advanced students are able to do them quickly, okay? But they still find the homework useful. I'll tell you why. But, students that really needed those sub-skills, really needed them, then their homework is going to take twice as long, okay? So it adapts to student skill level quite naturally. Yes, I'm just flashing that slide mostly. See what time I'm just flashing that slide mostly so that you can buy that book and read it. Like I said, unfortunately, he passed away last summer. This is a great book. It's a great read, even for those who don't know about deliberate practice. So yeah, but I want to warn you though, in this book, and not only this book, but the conversation about deliberate practice, most of what you hear about is this 10,000 hour rule, which is what Erickson and his group, sort of devised as a rule of thumb. So that 10,000 hours is what's required for someone to become an expert in their domain, right? But of course, for us in education, when we try to use deliberate practice, then we want students, for example, to acquire a certain level of mastery in balancing chemical equations, right? So of course, it doesn't take 10 hours, but who knows, 10 hours or something like that. But we have to just set the level of mastery that we're comfortable with, and then we use deliberate practice for students to get there, hopefully faster, okay? So whenever there are conversations about deliberate practice in education, these things are often missing. First, the practice. It's not enough that students just practice. It's important that the learning density increases, which means that if students were working 1 hour before to balance chemical equations and they achieved a certain level of mastery, it's important that you keep it to 1 hour, but now the level of mastery increases because you've used deliberate practice. And in order to do that, the practice has to be effortful, has to be strenuous. And in fact, Erickson and his group, they really stress that, okay? So, but as soon as you have effortful practice, now motivation, takes center stage. So how do you address motivation? That's very important to do. And I'll try to talk about that a little bit. And then, yeah, don't worry about the rest here. Time is flying. So transforming the weekly homework. So let me first talk about, because there are multiple studies that we did here. So the big one is a multi-year study, okay, where we build things gradually. So in year one, we had our, standard traditional homework. And for that particular homework, it was 10 complex problems, okay? And I call this traditional because that's typically what you think about as STEM homework. It's problems that are exam-like, and it gives students feedback on, hey, if you can do those well, then you should do okay on the exam, right? It's common sense, it's traditional. So in year two, what we did with the same course, same instructors and so forth, what we did is that now we added We kept the same complex problems, the exact same problems, but now we added 24 sub-skill problems to that. So now the number of problems ballooned up to 34. And like I said before, if students used to spend, let's say, 6 hours on here, and now they're spending 9 hours on here, you know, in a sense, who cares if they're learning more here, right? Because the time on task is higher. So the question is it possible to add sub-skills without increasing the time on task? That's a big question. And of course, is it possible to then measure a learning gain? Yeah, so of course the answer is yes. It is possible. It's hard though. So this is to give you an this is to give you an example of a complex problem. I don't want to describe the problem. It's a really cool problem. It's a complex problem. Yeah. So, well, maybe what what I should say is that what's going on? I want to go back. Yeah, the complex problem was about the topic of static equilibrium. And I'm just going to tell you that the spine here is being modeled as a beam, and there's a lot of forces on the spine, and students are being asked to find, hey, this particular muscle here applies a certain amount of force. What is it? And it turns out we have a wonderful demo at Harvard for that. It's a really nice problem. So, but it's complex. It involves a lot of sub-skills. And for those of you who have taught these things, you can see, oh boy, there's a lot going on here. So this is one of those sub-skills that was used, okay? Let me see here. So an important part of a sub-skill is the title at the top. If you recall, I said, whenever students are going through any part of the deliberate practice, it's important for students to know what they are doing and how it fits in the big picture. So actually, we spend quite a bit of time thinking about, okay, what should we put in bold here? Very few words that student can identify what they're practicing. And then here, we tell students, please read this over here. We hope they're going to read that where it fits in the bigger picture, okay? So that's important. The next thing that's important is that those sub-skills, the most advanced students, or even the instructor, should be able to do those very quickly. And this one, for those of you who know static equilibrium, you can tell an instructor can answer that in about 20 seconds, okay? Another part are the hints, okay? So those play an absolutely critical role. So students are able to uncover hints and to make sure that, they put in the effort. And when they uncover one hint, at least for that student population, we took off 5%. And that worked for that student population, which was, by the way, it was physics for life science majors, like algebra-based introductory physics. So hint 1, 2, and 3, so right here, and the hints are progressive. And it's very important that by the third or fourth hint, then almost everyone in the class will actually understand what the sub-skill is about. You can't leave half the class not understanding what it's about. So you have to reach mastery. And of course, at the end, there are a few that just still can't do it with the hints, but that's not good. Then you uncover the solution, and it's important that students, that the solution not be too long and so forth, that students really get a lot from the solution. So here's what it looked like, the study. So in year 1, in that course that I mentioned, very large introductory course, it was traditional lecture and traditional homework, and we used that as our baseline. In year 2, it was transform lecture, but the traditional homework. And then in year 3, it was the transform lecture and the transform homework, okay? So we measured the hopefully increased learning using a end of semester comprehensive final exam, the 3-hour final exam, which was unreleased each year. The instructors remained the same, and everything else was the same. Most importantly, the learning goals were the same. The labs were the same. Recitations were the same. So, So here are the data. So in year 1, okay, everything was traditional, and you can see that the 3-hour final exam, the average was about 70%. Now in year 2, we transformed the lecture only, and we got a learning gain of about 20%. I'm abusing the word learning gain a little bit, but okay, fine. Look, what was missing here from 70% to perfect understanding of 100% was 30%. And basically, students, the gain here is 20% of what was missing to get a perfect score. So that's how I'm using learning gain or knowledge gain. So yeah, so it increased by about 20%, which is sort of what you expect from the literature. So that's good. But then when we transformed the homework on top of transforming the lecture, then we got another learning gain of roughly 20%. So that was very satisfying. This means that you can get just about the same, learning gain by going further than the traditional lecture transformations. And just as important, in my opinion, is the time on task. So at the end of the semester, students were asked, hey, approximately what was the workload during the semester? And as you can see, students spend roughly 7 hours a week, and it stayed roughly the same. However, of course, that's self-reports, and of course, that's retrospective. So this should be taken with a grain of salt. And that's one of the reasons why we had to do further studies, which I'll show you in a second here. But another issue here, of course, is when you go from semester to semester, there are things that can change. Like, who knows, the instructors here maybe were more enthusiastic because now everything was changed and when they were here. Maybe that accounts partially for the difference in grades. So that called for a more controlled study, which we did, and I'll present in a minute. But we had an opportunity. So what I just showed you was for the fall semester of that year-long course, okay? That year-long course has mechanics in the fall and E&M in the spring. So now for the E&M part of the course, then we're able to replicate this study. But what we did, slightly different, is that initially everything was traditional in year one, okay? And then we transformed the lectures and the homework simultaneously. And what we got is a pretty large increase, which was a learning gain of about 40%. So that matches the transformation, the 3-year transformation in the previous course. So that was very satisfying to see. And again, the time on task in this case was about 10–15% higher. So what we can say at this point, if we believe these time on tasks, is to say that, well, look, you get great learning gains, but maybe it comes at a cost of 10–15%, larger time on task. But again, it called for more controlled studies, which is what I'm going to talk about in 20 seconds. But first, cohort number 2 here offered a unique perspective. So because these students in the fall semester, they had the transform lecture, and also in the spring semester, when they took E&M, they had the transform lecture as well, but the homework was now transformed. So this particular cohort of students could tell us what it's like to go from a traditional to a transform homework. And to give you a feeling of the survey results that we got, here's a good one. I felt like in PS2 is the fall semester is basically traditional homework. I felt that during the traditional homework, I spent hours trying to figure out very difficult problems that had many steps in them. And in that method, the main point that was supposed to get across got lost in the process, right? So that satisfies our intuition a little bit. Now, the thing I like the most is this. I find it useful even when I already know to do the short problems, the student meant sub skills here. It helps me put it all into place in my head. Now, I kind of figured that the most advanced students were going to be okay with the sub skills because they can do them quickly. But I must admit that I was a little surprised how much they said they benefited from the sub skills. But in retrospect, I started to understand through discussing that with students through the years, what happens. And what happens actually is that the most advanced students, on average, the most advanced students, they have this this organization of knowledge, like this concept map in their head. There's some loose connections and there's some dangling connections here and everything, but there's enough of that they can still do the complex problems fairly well. But now when they see the sub skills, what they're essentially telling us in those on structured interviews is that they're saying, you know what, seeing those sub skills, I already know how to do them, but it strengthens the connections. It kind of, yeah, the connections make more sense to me now. And we know from the literature that once you do that to a knowledge organization, it reduces the cognitive load significantly. So that's likely why those students spend much less time doing the homework than they would otherwise. So this is more of the same here. So yeah, so the more controlled experiment, I won't go through the nitty-gritty detail here, but long story short, instead of doing a semester long, we did it a week long. Okay, so when students were learning statics over here during 1 week, then half the class randomly assigned, half the class, they did the deliberate practice homework, while the other half of the class, they were assigned to traditional homework. And as soon as they handed in the homework, we gave them a test of learning. Okay, and of course, before the test of learning, students were asked the time on task. Hey, think about this past week. How much time did you spend on the homework? Okay. So, and then for the next topic on fluids, for the next topic in fluids, we swapped the groups. So the students who did the deliberate practice homework, now they did the traditional homework. And of course, we got the same effect. So that's the next slide here. So as you can see with fluids here, the transformed homework or deliberate practice homework got about a 15% learning gain from doing that. And then same thing with the other topic, but now the students who did the deliberate practice homework, now they were doing the traditional homework and vice versa. So still about a 15% learning gain. And most importantly, again, in my opinion, is that this increased learning is not because students spent more time when they did the deliberate practice homework. You see that it's about the same. Okay, so again, that's still self-reports, and they still had to think a week back, but of course it's got to be a bit more accurate. But then it called for another study, which unfortunately was cut in half because of the pandemic, but still in the other study, which I don't have a slide for, I'm going to tell you real quick. Basically, we used the recitation section as a homework section. We brought students in and we had an hour and a half block. And basically for an hour, students were doing the homework in front of us, okay? And then for the last 25 minutes or so, they would do a test of learning on the homework that they did. And we had something like 12 or 13 sections, right? So it was a very nice experiment. And having students in front of us, we didn't need to ask them, how much time did you spend? We could just keep track of it. And what's nice is that we found it was the same time on task. But unfortunately, when it came time to doing it again, but flipping the groups, that's when the pandemic happened. It's okay. Okay, great learning gains, wonderful. But is that easy to implement? And unfortunately, no. I wish I could say it is, but it isn't. And that's too bad. So at the beginning, when we did that, we got excited and we went into some other courses. And I would say that it failed twice, where one of the two times it was actually painful, because it's never fun to implement something course-wide and to see it fail. So we identified 4 failure modes, okay, for this thing. So one is that the person who's going to create or design those sub-skills has to be an expert tutor. And to be an expert tutor, not only should you have taught the course many times, but then you should have spoken to students about the concepts a lot. And then you have to develop an in-depth understanding of their thinking, right? Their common difficulties, common misconceptions, and the best ways, it seems, to fix those things, right? Not many people can do that in a department. So that's the bad part. And by the way, practically speaking, the best people to do that, we found, are graduate students that have been teaching the course for many years. And the last time they're going to teach the course, you tell them, all right, we'll hire you as a TA, and you're not going to teach. Instead, you're going to design those sub skills. And then you get the help of former undergrad students. This whole combination here is what leads to the best sub skills. Or you have someone, let's say like me, who I've taught a particular course for many, many years, and I happen to spend a lot of time with students, right? So, and I really ask a lot of questions. So I've become a pseudo expert tutor in at least one course. Yeah. Anyway, so it fails because of that. So what we did is we had the expert tutor for algebra-based physics for mechanics, and it worked amazing. That's the result that I presented to you. Then we took the same expert tutor, someone who really knew physics well, and that person developed the sub skills for the same course, but for slightly different population, for physics majors. And it failed. I mean, half the students enjoyed the sub skills, but the other half of the students hated them. So anyway, so 4 failure modes. Number 2 is if the sub skill tests 2 different things at the same time. You know, that sounds simple, but actually it's not. It's very important that someone knows they're practicing, you know, the toes on the board and not the knees, and not the combination of both. So another thing is that the sub skills have to be fast, and only an expert tutor can actually write sub skills that way. Yeah, they have to be fast. So it has to be that the most advanced students can do them quickly and still get the benefit that I explained earlier. Yeah. So the other thing is, and that's this study, unfortunately, and David, to you specifically, a lot of it is phenomenological. That's a hard word for me to say, right? Phenomenological. I mean, I would have liked to do a study where you try 80 sub skills, where you try this or that, but we didn't. So we found that it's about 30. Why 30? Well, because if you do the sub skills right and you have 30, you can keep the same time on task and you can get a large learning gain. Would you get the same thing if it was 50? I don't know. I don't think so.
Louis, this is Molly. I just wanted to check in with you about your schedule. It is 4 o'clock, and usually these do last an hour, but it sounds like you have more to say, and I just wanted to let people know if they need to leave. Louis has let us record this, so this will be available as a video recording probably next week. So how much more do you have of your talk? Can you give us a sense?
Actually, you know, the most important is pretty much done.
Okay.
Yeah. That's I think it's just 2 more slides. That's it.
All right, great. Why don't you just go ahead, and then if people want to stay, we can certainly keep the Zoom room open for a while if people want to ask questions. But I just wanted to let people know if you have to leave, you can catch the rest later. All right, thanks, Louis.
Of course. Yeah, so this is an example of a sub-skill that failed. Well, that was both successful in one course and failed in another. So long story short, this is just a free body diagram. For those in physics, you'll recognize that there's an angle here, and somehow this angle you can propagate it to be either the angle here or here or here or here. For some students, that's difficult. So it turns out that when you have the physics for life science majors, like the algebra-based physics, this is a great sub-skill. It makes it in the top 30 for that particular homework. When you have physics majors, well, trust me that in a class of 100, there's going to be about 5, maybe even 10 that will benefit from that. But for the whole class in general, it definitely doesn't make it in the top 30. And then the sub-skill was used, if I recall correctly, was used in physics for engineers. And some students definitely found it useful, but it should not have made it in the top 30. So I would say that it fails for these 2 courses, student population, but it's great for that. So you need different sub-skills for different student populations and for different courses. So yeah, the results right here. So the upside is, yeah, it's very popular. We've done this in about a dozen courses at Harvard, not just in physics. And just 2-3 weeks ago, I had a session with someone at USC. They're doing that there. So looks like it's growing. So that's nice. It's very popular with both students and faculty. And the downside is that it's very hard to do, very hard to do. And in the end here, I would like to acknowledge people that have really nice colleagues that have contributed to this work. I'm done.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's really incredible work that you're doing. So we have time for some questions if people want to unmute and jump in or ask a question in the chat. We can do that.
Well, first of all, as the host, I would like to thank you very much, Louis, for this, and also say that to the audience here, these kinds of studies that Louis is doing are really exemplary in terms of actually carefully measuring the results of the interventions or the changes. And I'm really surprised that there is so little work like this around MIT, which is founded on the idea of measuring stuff and either explaining it or figuring out from the measurement how to make it work better. So that's a comment. So I'll let other people ask questions.
Hi, Louis. Thank you so much for the presentation. One of the things I want to focus on a little bit is a little bit of the identification of subskills and the populations that it can go to support. One of the things that I think I heard when you sort of described this is it's a potential differentiator. So I guess the question becomes, do you have any inclinations, any ideas about how we start to identify the students who may benefit from more foundational subset skills in that practice versus maybe students who are further along in their learning journey, more expert, if you will, and don't need quite or need different sets of subsets within the same course? So how do we start to think about differentiating this within a course to support the differing level of students that we may see in, for example, a large introductory class?
Sure, that's a good question. So what people have done is, what you can do is to design a diagnostic, right? Some people sometimes use already made diagnostics like the FCI, well, I'm not going to say names, but some diagnostic at the beginning of the semester. And let's say you diagnose in a physics course that there's some students that need the remedial sort of instruction on calculus or something like that. Let's say you identify that. Then you can have this, you've targeted some students that need that, and then you just create some sort of extra material for that. So that's how you can do that. That's how you can do that. But the aim of what we were trying to do is to, and that's very difficult, and that's why you need an expert tutor to do that, is to come up with the best, I'm calling it 30, sometimes it was 35, 25, whatever, but the best 30 sub-skills for the entire group, right? So that's difficult. And then the constraint was that with the best 30 sub-skills, everyone has to be helped, and the time on task on average has to stay the same. So it's a little different maybe than what you just asked, right? Where you wanted to identify the subpopulation that really need remedial help. Am I right to say that?
Yeah, and so I guess one of the things that I'm reminded of is sort of like some of the diagnostic work being done in cognitive tutoring systems and understanding sort of using the responses within problems to sort of help understand what supports need to come next, even within the sort of sub-complex task. So it becomes more sort of
targeted.
Yeah, right, and less about thinking about it from the design in the front end of teaching towards sort of the middle most, but thinking about where we can actually identify the outliers and support them in the ways that they need to get up to the skill level that we want at the end.
Yeah, no, that's good, but you're a bit handcuffed when you do that, which, things like mastering physics and so forth, they do so wonderfully. But when you do that, you're a bit handcuffed to the, should I call it the quality of the diagnostic question, right? And those of us who have tried to validate, instruments, we know that, right? It's a lot of work to actually validate just one question, to make sure that every student that answers that question answers it in the way that it was intended, or actually understands the question the way that it was intended to be understood. So that that's kind of difficult to do. So first, to do what you just said, you have to have a designer that will, first create all those diagnostic questions. Yeah, that's not easy to do.
I have only two questions, please. The first one is a practical one, which is actually I am teaching engineering. I am a TA, but actually I have tried to apply the active learning technique in one of my classes, but unfortunately I got only 20% of my objective of teaching is only done. And actually sometimes I feel like a kind of chaos is being in my class because of dividing students and etc. But actually my case is different because our curriculum is very congested, and actually one of my objectives is to cover as much as problems as I can, because they are going to have a midterm quiz, etc., and solving mathematical problems, physical ones, etc. So that how can I employ the active learning technique but to serve this congested curriculum? That is my first question. Okay. The second one, the effortful practice. To what limit can I do effortful practice? Which means, what is the criteria to tell that, okay, it's fine, this level of effortful practice is fine, and stop here and continue your learning process? You got my question, Doctor? Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, very good questions. So your first question on you being able, I think, to cover only roughly 20%.
20% of my objective of teaching. Actually, one of my objectives is to cover for about 10 or 20 problems during my tutorial, solving example from Pearson or any reference. Never mind. But actually, if I lost my time during my tutorial, if I failed to imply the active learning technique in my tutorial, and actually do not cover all these problems, then the main task of my teaching load is getting lost. Actually, one of my objectives is to cover all these problems, because students have a midterm, for example, quiz, for example, so that the task is to solve pure problems away from active learning. But I'm trying a lot to imply active learning during my teaching as a TA. That is my first question.
Okay, how about this? Yeah, how about this? Whenever you use active learning for the vast majority of active learning techniques, then the teaching or the amount of information sort of delivered per unit time goes down. I'm not going to say learning goes down, okay? But the coverage, that's what I should say, goes down. In fact, peer instruction, which is probably the most well-known type of active learning, the coverage goes down by about a factor of 2 when compared to a traditional lecture. So then right there, your coverage suffers if you do that. But the type of active learning that we developed, the one that I described here, where you interrupt students, is the only one that I know that you can cover as much. But then it's really hard. It requires a lot of training, because students have to be, they don't have to feel weird all the time about being interrupted. They have to stay motivated and so forth. So you have to keep intervening and everything. But to address your question, I would say my guess is that there are 2 issues. When you say 2 questions, 20 questions, maybe you're trying to cover too much. And at the same time, if you do active learning, invariably, the coverage is going to go down. So I think it's probably a combination of both. That'll be my guess.
Yes, that's a trade-off.
Yeah. So, and to your second question, I'm sorry, like I'm fighting a horrible headache.
How can I tell that I have reached a good level of effortful learning or effortful practicing? The effortful, which was by Erickson, as I think. The slide of the
How can you tell if students are putting in the effort?
How can I tell that if I'm a student, I'm studying the course X, for example, and I'm going to do effortful practice? You doctors told us that the practice should be effortful, which is dense practice, not being a relaxed practice.
Well, there's two things here.
Yeah.
Students can do a self-assessment if they're, if they feel like they're putting in a large degree of effort, and that's likely to be accurate. But then the second thing here that might be of an issue is if it's productive, right? And for it to be productive, you need someone maybe like you that's an expert coach, someone that will have designed the complex problems, design the sub skills and so forth. So students will know, they'll tell you if they're maximally engaged, they'll tell you, they sense that, and I'm sure that's accurate. But the second part is, the productivity part. That depends on you, not on the student.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Thank you.
There's a question from Megan Talkington in the chat. Megan asks, you alluded to addressing the issue of motivation, perhaps including with a computer system. Can you speak more about that?
Oh, yeah. That's a good question. That's really hard. In fact, motivation, we have the big three, right? We have students have to feel a sense of control, okay? They have to feel a personal relevance to what they're learning, and they have to have a sense of self-efficacy, okay? Like, I have a high degree of confidence that I can learn this thing. So to address motivation, then you go after one of these three, and hopefully you can hit 2 out of 3, okay? So one thing is self-efficacy, and for us, it's with the hints. So you want to make sure that the hints are really well designed, and those are hard to do, okay? For the entire population of students in your course to be able to feel like they have self-efficacy by the third hint, that they know they have confidence, they'll be able to understand. The other thing is that there's a little bit of sense of control, but not that much, but it's better than being controlled by an instructor. And what's the other one? Personal relevance. That's something we can't always achieve, but whenever you design sub-skills or the complex problems, you always try, being an expert tutor, you always try to make sure that to the students, it feels personally relevant. That is, it feels like they're making progress to their goal of understanding the material. And sometimes we give problems, myself included, where students don't feel that way. They feel, come on, this has just been added to fill a hole. It's not going to help me do well in this course. So that will be the personal relevance part. I hope that answers the question. But yeah, that part's really hard.
Thank you. Dave, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, just a quick question, Louis. So when you say 30 comments, 30
sub-skills,
specific skills, I assume that that's over the whole semester. So that just means 2 a week.
No, it's 30 sub-skills per week.
Oh, okay, that's your unit. All right, great.
Yeah, 30 per week. So every week students had roughly 10 complex problems, which for those of us who have taught physics, chemistry, that seems reasonable. And then on top of that, we put in like 25 extra or 30 extra sub-skills.
Right, but I see. So there are 30 sub-skill questions, but does that mean but I mean, like 4 of them might be on how to find torque, and 3 of them might be on angular momentum. I mean, how many topics like torque and angular momentum do you have?
That's a good question. For example, 1 week on static equilibrium, I had that problem there for the spine.
Yep.
So so we have a bunch of complex problems for static equilibrium. That's one major topic in introductory physics. And there's a lot of sub-skills that are needed to do well with that overall topic. And we can only use 30. So which means, for example, Dave, for students to be able to find the torque, just the torque, I can think of, we could probably come up together 50 sub-skills just for that thing. Yeah. So, but your job is to find the 4 or so sub-skills that will be maximally impactful.
That week. Okay, fine.
That week, just for the torque. And then you got to find another 3 or 4 sub-skills for finding the pivot, which is another sub-skill. So then, and so forth and so forth. Then when you're at 30, you gotta stop. Yeah, so
Okay.
that's about 300 to 400 sub-skills per semester.
Any other questions? Thank you so much. This was
You're
great.
very welcome. All right, bye everyone. Bye. Deb.
Bye-bye.